She was supposed to spend the rest of her life mourning her husband. That was the expectation. That had always been the expectation. But what nobody in that community knew, what nobody even suspected, was that for 6 months, a secret had been growing right under their noses. Hidden in plain sight. Hiding inside ordinary things. A parked truck at the end of a farm lane. A curtain pulled just slightly to the side. A folded note tucked beneath a jar of preserves on a porch step. And one woman who was slowly, terrifyingly falling in love with a man she was absolutely forbidden to love. An English doctor. When it finally came out, and it did come out, because secrets in Amish communities always come out, eventually the fallout was unlike anything that Church District had seen in a generation. Families were divided. Old friendships ended overnight. A bishop who had led that community for 30 years was seen weeping after a private meeting. And one woman stood at the center of it all, facing a choice that would either cost her everything she had ever known, or break the part of herself she had only just discovered. Some people called what happened between them love. Others called it the worst kind of betrayal. But before anyone knew the full truth, something else happened first. A secret within the secret. And when I tell you what it was, I think you will understand why this story has stayed with me for years. Before we go any further, welcome to the channel. If you love hidden Amish stories, untold community secrets, and real-life inspired Amish narratives, subscribe right now and turn on notifications. We release new stories every single week, and trust me, you do not want to miss what is coming. Now let us begin. My name does not matter. What matters is that I grew up Amish. Old Order, Lancaster County, Pennsylvania. I lived inside those walls, physical and invisible, until my mid-20s, and when I left, I carried pieces of that world with me. I always will. But leaving also kept certain doors open. Women I had grown up with found quiet ways to stay in contact. And over the years stories reached me. Stories the community would rather keep buried. This is one of those stories. Her name was Hannah, not her real name, but close enough to honor who she was. She was 34 years old when her husband Eli died. Heart attack, February. The middle of the night. He was 41 years old, and he had never complained of pain a day in his life. Strong and steady, and present in the way that good Amish husbands are trained to be present. And then, without warning, he was gone. Hannah had 4 children. The oldest was 10. The youngest had just turned 3. She found him in the early hours of the morning. She had reached for him in the dark the way she had reached for him every morning for 11 years, and his side of the bed was cold. She told someone, much later, that she lay still for a long time before she fully understood. She kept waiting to hear him downstairs, the fire being stoked, his boots on the kitchen floor, but the house was too quiet, and eventually the quiet told her what she already knew. Now in the outside world, a young widow with 4 children would be surrounded by options, support networks, the freedom to make her own choices about her future. In an old order Amish community, it is different. The community rallied around Hannah, the way Amish communities do with food, with labor, with the particular kind of practical love that does not ask questions and does not need to be thanked. Men came to work the farm, women came to sit with her in the evenings. Her church district wrapped around her like a firm, warm hand. But underneath all of that warmth was a structure as solid and immovable as stone. Hannah was expected to grieve within certain limits, to remain separate from the English world, to raise her children inside the faith, to eventually perhaps consider remarrying, but only within the community, only to a man approved by the bishop, and only when enough time had passed that it would not look indecent. She was 34 years old, and her future had already been decided by people who loved her, and meant well, and had not once thought to ask her what she wanted. For the first few months, Hannah did exactly what was expected. She grieved, she worked, she prayed. She tucked her children in at night, and told them God had a plan, even when her own faith felt thin and fragile as ice in early spring. She was doing everything right. But what nobody saw, what nobody thought to look for, was what was happening underneath. Because grief does something to people that communities are not always prepared for. It strips away the performance. It peels back the layers of who you were supposed to be, and leaves something raw and honest underneath. And what Hannah found underneath in those long, sleepless, silent nights was a woman she did not entirely recognize, a woman with questions she had never been allowed to ask, a woman who was beginning, slowly and terrifyingly, to wonder if the life she was supposed to return to was the life she actually wanted. She did not tell anyone this. She barely admitted it to herself. But what happened 4 months after Eli's death would change everything, and it began in the most ordinary way imaginable. His name was Dr. Thomas Caldwell. English through and through, 42 years old. He had been practicing family medicine in that rural county for 8 years, driving his blue pickup truck down dirt farm lanes, carrying his medical bag into homes that had no electricity and no running water, treating families who sometimes consulted their bishop before they consulted him. He had grown up in Philadelphia. He had gone to a good medical school. He could have built a comfortable suburban practice and spent his career seeing patients in a climate-controlled office with a receptionist and a coffee machine. Instead, he had come out here, and no one, including Thomas himself, had ever fully been able to explain why. He was a quiet man, careful with words, divorced once, cleanly, without bitterness, no children. He sometimes noticed this in other people's homes, the presence of children filling a space with a particular kind of noise and warmth, and he felt the absence of it in a way he had learned not to dwell on. What he was, more than anything else, was a man who paid attention. He had been caring for Amish families long enough to understand that this was not a world to be romanticized or pitied. It was a complex, functioning, deeply intentional community with its own beauty and its own costs. He respected it. He worked within it. He was trusted by people who trusted very few outsiders. He knew Hannah's family from a professional distance. He had treated her older children for minor things. He had attended Eli's death, technically, signing the paperwork, though by the time he arrived there was nothing to be done. He had seen Hannah at the door that night, and he had thought briefly that she was one of the most composed people he had ever seen in the immediate aftermath of loss. Not cold, not numb, just very, very still, like someone holding themselves together through sheer will. He had thought about her, occasionally in the months that followed, as a doctor thinks about a patient in a difficult situation, professionally, with appropriate distance. At least that is what he told himself. And then, on a warm Thursday afternoon in late spring, Hannah's youngest child developed a serious respiratory infection, and Thomas was called to the farmhouse. He examined the boy, left a prescription, said he would check back the following day. He drove home that evening, and realized he had been thinking about what to say when he came back, before he had even reached the end of the farm lane. He pushed the thought away. He was a professional. He had been in this county for 8 years without a single complication of this kind. That should have been the end of it. He should have sent a colleague to do the follow-up. He didn't. When Thomas returned the next afternoon, little Samuel was already improving, fever broken, sitting up asking for apple butter. Thomas sat at Hannah's kitchen table while she made tea. They talked about nothing particular. The farm, his work, the way the fields had come in that spring. She asked him a question that surprised him. She asked whether he ever got lonely, out here in the countryside, so far from the city he had grown up in. He paused. No one in 8 years had asked him that question directly. He said, "Sometimes, yes." She said, "I thought so. You have that look." He asked what look. She said, "Like someone who is used to being the one who takes care of things and not the one who gets taken care of." He looked at her across the table and did not say anything for a moment. She was the first person in a very long time who had looked at him and seen something true. He left 40 minutes later. He drove home. He sat in his truck in his own driveway for 5 minutes before going inside, and he told himself firmly that he needed to be more careful. Over the following weeks he was more careful. He sent a colleague for 2 follow-up appointments. He kept his own visits short and entirely clinical. And then Hannah herself got sick. A respiratory infection that would not clear. It required 3 visits over 2 weeks. And something about the combination of her illness and her stubbornness, the way she kept insisting she was fine while clearly running a fever, still getting up at 5 to feed the animals, made him feel something he had been successfully avoiding. Real personal, not entirely professional concern. On the 3rd visit he told her, gently but firmly, that she needed to rest, that she was running her body into the ground trying to hold everything together. She looked at him and said, "I don't have the option of resting, Dr. Caldwell." He said, "I know. But we need to find a way." He used that word without thinking, and the moment it came out, something shifted in the air between them. Neither of them acknowledged it. They talked about practical adjustments to her schedule. He left after 20 minutes. But we had been said, and both of them had heard it. 3 days later, Hannah's oldest daughter, Grace, 10 years old, sharp as a pin, looked up from her dinner plate at her mother and said, very casually, "Mama, why do you smile right before the doctor's truck comes down the lane?" The table went quiet. Hannah said, "What do you mean?" Grace said, "I have noticed it 3 times now. You hear the engine and you fix your hair before you go to the door. You do not do that for anyone else." Her older son snorted. Her younger daughter looked confused. Hannah kept her face perfectly still and said, "I am simply trying to be presentable, Grace, that is all." Grace looked at her for a long moment with those quiet, serious eyes, and said nothing more. But Hannah knew, from that moment on, that she was not as invisible as she had thought. It was not Grace who caused the first real trouble. It was a neighbor woman named Ruth. Ruth had come by one afternoon to return a borrowed pot, and had seen the blue pickup truck parked at the end of the farm lane, the far end, where the lane bends behind a stand of oak trees. Not in front of the house. At the far end, she stopped. She looked. She told herself it was probably nothing. But she had been in this community long enough to know that doctors did not typically park at the far end of a lane when making a house call. They parked at the door. She did not confront Hannah. She did not say anything to her husband that night. She sat with what she had seen for 3 full days, and then she said something, just one thing, to one person. A trusted woman in the quilting circle. She said, "I am not saying anything is happening. I am just saying I saw the truck, and it was not parked where it should have been. That was all. It was enough." The Amish grapevine, and I say this as someone who grew up inside it, is one of the most efficient information networks in the world. People who live without television and smartphones find other ways to communicate, and a good piece of gossip in a small community travels faster than almost anything. Within 10 days, the story had grown in the way that stories always grow in the retelling. Some versions said he came every week. Some said the visits lasted hours. One version claimed entirely falsely that a child from a neighboring farm had seen Hannah and the doctor walking together in the back fields at dusk. None of this was accurate, but none of it needed to be accurate to do damage. Hannah's brother Daniel arrived on a Saturday morning without warning. He did not knock. He walked into the kitchen, sat down at the table, and looked at his sister with an expression she had not seen on his face since the night Eli died. He said, "I have heard things, Hannah." She said, "Then you have been listening to people who do not have enough to occupy themselves." He said, "I have heard it from 3 different families." She said, "Then 3 families have too much time." His jaw tightened. He said, "Hannah, do you understand what happens if the bishop hears this?" She looked at her brother, this man she had grown up beside, who had protected her, and guided her, and yes, sometimes controlled her, with the best of intentions, and she felt something shift inside her chest. She said, "I understand perfectly well what happens. I grew up in this community the same as you did." Daniel said, "Then act like it." He left. Hannah stood in the kitchen for a long time afterward, and she thought about something Thomas had said to her during that last visit, almost in passing, when she had mentioned how exhausted she was of being watched. He had said, "You know, most people who are watched that closely are actually worth watching." She had smiled at that. She had smiled for the rest of the afternoon, and that was the moment she understood that she was in real trouble. What I am about to tell you now is the part of this story that very few people know. Even within the community, this detail was kept quiet. I am sharing it because it is important, and because Hannah eventually gave permission for this story to be told. Thomas left something on the porch. Not a letter, not flowers, nothing that obvious. A book. A small plain book of poetry. Not wrapped, no note attached. Just left beside the door one morning when Hannah came out to start her day, sitting on top of the porch railing as if it had always been there. She stood in the cold morning air and looked at it for a long moment before she picked it up. She opened the cover. Inside, in his handwriting, he had written just one line. Not a declaration. Not anything that could be used against either of them. Just a line from one of the poems inside the book, with a tiny mark beside it. She found the page. She read the line. It was about belonging, about the particular ache of a person who feels that they belong to 2 worlds and can fully claim neither. She stood on that porch for a very long time. Then she took the book inside. She wrapped it in a piece of cloth and tucked it at the bottom of the chest at the foot of her bed, underneath the quilts, where no one would ever find it. She did not tell anyone. Not a single person. But 2 nights later, she could not sleep, and she got up in the dark and took the book out of the chest and read it by lamplight until nearly 4 in the morning. When she finally put it away, she sat in the dark kitchen and held her own hands and asked herself, for the first time out loud, what she was doing. She did not have an answer. But somewhere in the county, in a house that was very quiet at 4 in the morning, Thomas was not sleeping either. Hannah had been expecting something official. She had felt it coming for weeks. The way you feel a storm before you see it in the air, in the way people looked at her slightly too long after services, in the careful way her sister-in-law chose her words. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was in German, handwritten, from the bishop. Hannah opened it at the kitchen table with the children at school. She read it once quickly, then she set it down. Then she picked it up and read it again, slowly. The bishop had written with pastoral care, and she could feel that he meant it sincerely. He did not accuse, he expressed concern. He referenced the community's responsibility to protect its members from the world. He asked her to come and speak with him before the next Sunday service. He did not mention Thomas by name. He did not need to. Hannah put the letter on the table. Her hands were steady, but her mind was moving very fast, because as she read it a second time, she realized something she had not expected. She realized she was not afraid. She had been waiting for this letter for weeks, dreading it the way you dread a reckoning, and now that it was here she felt something closer to clarity than fear. She was not afraid, she was tired. Tired of managing other people's comfort. Tired of performing a grief that had already moved through its first raw phase into something more complicated. Tired of making herself smaller so that the community's idea of who she was could remain undisturbed. She sat at that table for a long time. Then she got up, went to the chest, and pulled out the book. She held it, she looked at the line he had marked. She made a decision. She picked up a pen and wrote a letter. Not to the bishop. Not yet. To Thomas. She told him what had happened. She told him about the bishop's letter. She told him she did not know what she was going to do yet, but that she wanted him to know from her, and not from rumor, that the situation had escalated. She told him she was not asking for anything. She told him she simply needed to be honest with someone. She folded the letter. She drove the buggy to the edge of the county road, stopped at the old stone fence, and left the letter under the top stone. It was a location they had never explicitly agreed on. It was simply the one that made sense to her. She drove home. 2 days later, she passed the stone fence on her way to pick up the children. The letter was gone. In its place was a single folded piece of paper. She drove home before she opened it. Thomas had written, "I heard about the bishop. I am sorry. Whatever you decide, I want you to know that I do not regret a single conversation, not one. Tell me what you need." Hannah read it, folded it, put it inside the book, put the book back in the chest, and then the Sunday service arrived, and nothing would be quiet after that. If you have been with this story from the beginning, take a moment right now to like this video. It helps more than you know, and allows us to keep bringing these hidden stories to light. Now let us continue, because what happened next is the part of this story most people never hear. The service was held at a neighboring farm. The community gathered. The hymns were sung in German, slow and ancient and full of a beauty that I still feel in my chest when I remember it. The sermon was long. The fellowship meal afterward was warm. Hannah sat with the women. She smiled when spoken to. She kept her children close. She was to all outward appearances entirely composed. Then the bishop asked her to stay behind. Several people noted this. Several people positioned themselves where they could watch without obviously watching. The conversation happened in a quiet corner of the yard, under a large oak tree. It lasted about 20 minutes. Nobody could hear what was said, but everyone could see Hannah's face, and what they saw was not what they expected. They expected the downcast eyes, the quiet nods, the posture of a woman receiving correction and accepting it with appropriate humility. That is not what they saw. They saw Hannah look the bishop directly in the eye. They saw her speak with her chin level, and her hands still at her sides. They saw her say something that made the bishop, this man who had led the community for 30 years, take a visible step back. They saw him put his hand over his mouth briefly, the way people do when they are surprised. They saw Hannah nod once, deliberately, and then walk away. She collected her youngest from her sister-in-law's arms, gathered her other children, and walked to the buggy without looking at anyone. The bishop stood under that oak tree for a long time. Nobody approached him. Hannah drove home. She fed her children. She put them to bed. She sat in the dark kitchen, and then someone knocked at the door. It was not her brother, not a deacon, not anyone she expected. It was a woman named Miriam, one of the older women in the church district, someone who had known Hannah since childhood. Miriam was in her 60s, small and serious, not someone who came calling unannounced. She sat down at the table. She looked at Hannah for a long time. Then she said, "What did you say to him?" Hannah said, "I told him the truth." Miriam said, "What truth?" Hannah said, "That I am a grown woman, that I have buried my husband, that I have raised 4 children alone for the better part of a year, and that I will not be made to feel like a sinner for having a conversation with a decent man." Miriam was quiet. Then she said, "Hannah, do you understand what he could do?" Hannah said yes. Miriam said, "And you are not afraid?" Hannah looked at her and said, "I am terrified, but I am more tired of being afraid than I am afraid of what comes next." Miriam sat at that table for another half hour without saying much. When she left, she squeezed Hannah's hand at the door and said nothing, but Hannah noticed that her eyes were wet. Now here is where the story takes a turn that almost nobody in that community ever knew about. A turn that changes everything you thought you understood about how this story unfolded. The bishop, after his conversation with Hannah at the service, did not simply pray and wait. He acted. He contacted the county medical board. Not with a direct accusation, he was too careful for that, and too experienced to leave fingerprints on something like this. He sent a concerned inquiry, a pastoral letter, vague, carefully worded, referencing appropriate boundaries in rural medical practice, the vulnerability of grieving families, the doctor's close relationship with a recently widowed patient. He did not name Hannah directly, he did not name Thomas directly, but the meaning was clear to anyone who read it carefully, and the people at the medical board read things carefully. Thomas received the inquiry on a Thursday morning. It was not a sanction. It was not a formal complaint. It was a request for a written response. But anyone who has ever dealt with a professional licensing board knows that a request for a written response is not nothing. It is the first step in a process that can end careers. Thomas read it twice. He sat at his kitchen table for a very long time. He thought about his 8 years in that county, the families he had treated, the trust that had been built slowly and genuinely. He thought about Hannah, and he made a decision. He drove to the farmhouse that same evening. Hannah opened the door and looked at his face and immediately said, "What happened?" He told her, all of it. The letter to the medical board, the inquiry, what it could mean for his license and his practice. He told her clearly and without softening it because she had specifically asked him, months ago, to always tell her the truth. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Daniel." He looked at her. She said, "It was Daniel. I know it was Daniel. He is the only person who knew enough and cared enough and was desperate enough to do something like this." Thomas said, "Hannah, you do not know that for certain." She said, "I know my brother." She was right. She did know her brother, and she was right. What happened next was one of the most difficult conversations of Hannah's life. She went to Daniel. She sat across from him at his kitchen table, in his house, with his wife present, and she asked him directly, "Did you send something to Thomas's medical board?" Daniel looked at his wife. He looked at the table, and then he looked at his sister, and said yes. He said he had been watching for weeks. He had found the stone fence by accident, following Hannah one afternoon out of worry. He had found one of the notes, not the book, just a note, a brief one, but enough, and he had been terrified. Not for the community, not for the rules, for her. He said, "Hannah, I was watching you disappear into something I could not protect you from, and I did the only thing I could think of to stop it." Hannah looked at her brother for a very long time. Then she said, "You did not protect me, Daniel. You made a choice for me, and you did not have the right." Daniel did not answer. His wife looked at the floor. Hannah left. She did not speak to her brother for 4 months after that. It was the longest silence between them in their lives. Thomas responded to the medical board inquiry carefully and professionally, and the matter was eventually closed without formal action, but the damage had been done in a different way. Because now Thomas understood, fully and without any remaining ambiguity, what staying in that county would continue to cost, not just Hannah but himself, and the practice he had spent 8 years building, and the families who depended on him. He was offered a position at a hospital 3 hours away, better resources, a teaching role, more stability. He told Hannah about it at the kitchen table, over tea that had gone cold because neither of them wanted to be the first to end the conversation. She asked, "What do you want to do?" He said, "I do not know. For the first time in years I do not know what I want, because what I want depends on factors I do not have the right to factor in." She understood what he meant. She said, "You should go. If it is a good opportunity, you should go." He said, "Hannah." She said, "I am not saying that to be noble. I am saying it because I am not going to leave. I have looked at that question from every angle, and I am not leaving my children's world. Not yet, maybe not ever, and I am not going to be the reason you stay somewhere that stops being right for you." He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, "You know what the worst part is?" She said, "What?" He said, "The worst part is that this conversation is proof of exactly what I am going to miss." She smiled. Not a sad smile, a real one. He left. He took the position. He was gone by the end of autumn. Hannah stayed. She kept the farm. She raised her children. Grace grew into the extraordinary young woman that all the signs had promised she would be, questioning, thoughtful, faithful in her own complex way. Daniel came back into her life slowly, painfully, the way people come back after they have done something that cannot be undone but can, eventually, be understood. He asked for her forgiveness. It took her a long time to give it, but she gave it, because he was her brother, and because she understood, finally, that he had been afraid not of the rules, not of the community's judgment, but of losing her to a world he had no way of following her into. His fear had made him do a terrible thing, but the fear itself she understood. The bishop retired 2 years later. Before he did, he came to Hannah's farm, he sat at her table, he drank tea. He told her, almost as an aside, that in 50 years of ministry, she was one of the few people who had ever made him genuinely reconsider something he thought he already knew. She thanked him. He said no. Thank you. She did not ask him about the letter to the medical board. She already knew. Some things are better left in the space between what happened and what was said. 3 years after Thomas left the county, Hannah was at a market in a town 2 counties away with her oldest son when she turned a corner and stopped walking. Standing at the far end of the market aisle, looking at a display of jarred preserves with the same quiet attention he brought to everything, was Thomas. He had not seen her yet. She had a few seconds where she could have turned around, gone a different way, let him remain a memory in a book, in a chest at the foot of her bed. She did not turn around, she walked toward him. He looked up when she was about 20 feet away, and went completely still, like someone who has seen something they were not sure was real. Then he said her name, just her name, and she said his. And they stood there in the middle of that market aisle, 2 people who had managed to love each other in the most inconvenient and honest and unresolvable way. And they talked for 45 minutes, about the children, about his work, about the county, about nothing very important, about everything. When they finally said goodbye, she said, "I still have the book." He looked at her for a moment and then he said, "I know. I wrote that line because I thought you would understand it." She said, "I understood it the first morning." He said, "I know that too." They stood there for one more moment, and then she turned and walked back to find her son, and he stood in that market aisle and watched her go. She told a friend years later about that afternoon. The friend asked, "Was it hard?" And Hannah thought about it for a long time before she answered. She said, "It was the opposite of hard. It felt like being reminded that something I had been afraid was only in my imagination was actually real, that I had not invented it, that it had happened, and it was true, and it belonged to me, even if I could not keep it." The friend said, "Do you wish it had gone differently?" Hannah said, "I used to ask myself that. I do not anymore. I think the path we took was the path that let both of us remain who we were, and I think that matters more than the ending." Hannah is still there, still on that farm, still at services on Sunday, still baking bread on Thursday mornings and folding her children's clothes with care and remembering Eli's face every single day. But she is also the woman who wrote the letter, who told the bishop she intended to use her mind and her heart, who stood in a yard in the morning light and said, "This is real, and I am not going to pretend that it is not." She is still sometimes seen walking in the fields behind the farmhouse in the late afternoon, not working, not hurrying, just walking, face turned toward the sun. Someone who knows her told me she looks like a woman who made peace with something. I asked, "Peace with what?" She said, "With having wanted something real, and having had it, even if she could not keep it." I think about that a lot, about what it costs to want something real, about what it means to let yourself be seen, truly seen in a world that has very specific ideas about who you are supposed to be, about the particular courage of a woman who did not leave, did not surrender, did not perform the neat resolution that everyone around her was waiting for, but simply chose, every day, to be fully and honestly herself inside the life she had been given. That is not a small thing. That is not a small thing at all. If this story moved you, leave a comment below and tell me what you would have done in her situation. Would you have written that letter? Would you have sent him away? Would you have stayed or walked away from everything? There is no wrong answer. That is what makes her story so hard and so honest. Subscribe for more hidden Amish stories and untold community secrets. These are real lives, real choices, real heartbreaks, and the women inside them deserve to be remembered.